Hello and welcome to our webinar Q&A series. My name is Snell. I'm the Academic Program Director at Macquarie Business School. I look after the Global MBA. I have a very special guest to introduce to you this morning, or in fact this afternoon. It is 12 p.m. Sydney, Australia time. I have Juliet Bourke, who is a partner of Human Capital at Deloitte. Welcome to this series, Juliet.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. We are actually talking today about an article that Juliet is one of the lead authors for. It was recently published in March this year. It's titled Why Inclusive Leaders Are Good for Organisations and How to Become One. Just some key stats for you to begin. It was the #1 article on Harvard Business Review on the subscription list when it was published. It's gathered over 100,000 views, and it is in fact the top ranked article, HBR article on Instagram. So not a bad result, Juliet.
It was very impressive. It signals that there's a real interest in inclusive leadership.
Very topical at the moment, and to top that all off, really, you collected 2 awards along the way, the Australian Psychological Society Award and the UK Apollo Project Award. So 2 very prestigious awards. So congratulations again.
Thank you.
So obviously, if we could just switch over to the article so that people who've joined us can have a semblance of what this article looks like. It's on HBR, the platform, and I'm just going to share some of the keynote findings and then ask Juliet to talk a bit more about these findings. So, for example, teams with inclusive leaders are 17% more likely to report that they're high performing, 20% more likely to say they make high quality decisions, and 29% more likely to report behaving collaboratively. So they're pretty significant findings, Juliet. Can you take us through, firstly, how you went about your research project? Who did you talk to? What was the methodology?
So actually I'm going to start way back in 2011.
Go, yeah.
And that was when we were doing research on understanding what inclusion means. So there are a number of fantastic academic researchers who've looked at defining inclusion, and we stood on their shoulders and used some of their work and built on it. And back then there was a piece of research we did called Waiter, Is That Inclusion in My Soup? A new recipe to improve business performance. And found that inclusion really comprises 3 parts. The first part is that people feel that they're treated fairly and respectfully. It's all about participation, inclusion, just getting into the game. The second level of inclusion is where people feel this sense of value and belonging. They really feel that the team, the organisation, the leader understands them as an individual and seeks them to be part of the group. So they feel that they're heard, they feel appreciated. And the last part of inclusion is where people feel psychologically safe. So it's almost like you are so included in the group that you can be very different to the group and still be part of the group. The group won't eject you because of difference. So your inclusion is not contingent on sameness. It's actually inclusion of difference. So that's the starting point, understanding what inclusion meant. And then we did a lot of research around the world to sort of validate that, as have others. And from that, we could see that there were 2 key drivers in terms of individuals' feelings of inclusion. One was sort of an organisational setting, as sort of the strategy sitting behind it. But the other one that was really important was the behaviour of leaders. And that was intriguing. What are these leaders doing to help individuals to feel included, and then pursuing that to a team-based outcome? So that was our starting point. And then in 2015, we started doing a lot of research, interviews with highly inclusive leaders, to ask them, what are you thinking about and what do you do? We wanted to sort of start from a blank page, interviewing their followers so that we could calibrate, is this what you see the leader doing? And interviews with subject matter experts. And from that, we developed this framework called the 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. And we started to iterate it and validate it. And now we've used that with more than 4,000 raters globally to assess 500 global leaders.
And that's a pretty impressive and also wide scope in terms of your country representation. I know that you included in that mix would be Japan, Ireland, Spain and Netherlands. And so there'll be some interesting nuanced findings, I'm sure, that will come out of it. But I'm going to take you back to the 6 traits that you identified in your research piece. And so could you take us through what those inclusive leadership traits are? Sorry, before we ask you that question, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but you've just provided a beautiful contextualization of the term inclusion. Does that differ from inclusion to inclusive leadership?
So inclusion is the outcome of inclusive leadership. Well, not only inclusive leadership, I think it's also the behaviours of team members too, but it is an outcome of that. So we can correlate the two.
Okay.
And that's why, you were able to say that the team performance improves. So we look at inclusive leadership, we correlate that with inclusion. We can see that inclusive leaders make up to a 70% difference in terms of individuals' feelings of inclusion. And we can see that those individuals who are feeling more included then work within a team, which is more likely to say it's high-performing, collaborative, makes good decisions.
Okay, so if inclusion is the outcome, take us through what those 6 traits of inclusive leadership looks like.
Okay. So the starting point around that, and we call them the 6 C's of inclusive leadership because I work in consulting, and so, we need alliteration so that we remember things. And they are legitimate constructs, even though they start with C, although you'll see one of them is sort of shoehorned into it. Okay. So the first one is commitment. And what we understand commitment to mean now, so people looking at leaders and saying, is this leader inclusive? I look for why are they thinking about inclusive leadership? The very first thing they look at is values. So is this aligned to someone's values? Is it something driving them from the inside? Then they look at, do they articulate the business case in some way? Do they make it a priority? That means do they put time and energy into it? And lastly, are they brave? Do they challenge the status quo? So that goes into a set of questions around commitment. Do individuals feel that their leaders are committed because it's aligned to their values, because they believe in the business case and articulate it, they put time and energy into it as a priority, and they challenge the status quo? That's the first one. The second one is around courage. And what we mean by courage now is the courage to be humble, the courage to be brave. It's a very engaging strategy for an inclusive leader to say, I don't know everything, I make mistakes, so other people will follow, rather than sort of the bravado, the confidence. We had thought originally that courage comprised 2 factors, which was bravery and humility. It turns out bravery is a signal of commitment. So if you're brave, if you're challenging the status quo, people perceive you as committed. So that's why it's sort of clustering under the first one. So we've got commitment, we've got then courage to be humble, we've got cognizance of bias. So these highly inclusive leaders are aware of their biases, that they sort of know themselves. Secondly, they self-regulate, so they adjust their behaviours to try and counter the bias. And thirdly, they look at the system and they understand if they're making fair decisions, so in relation to performance or work allocation. So that's the third one. So we've got commitment, we've got courage, we've got cognizance of bias. The fourth one is curiosity. So these highly inclusive leaders have a very open mindset. So these are the kinds of leaders who don't just say, I have an open door policy, but they actually walk outside of the door. They're trying to gather diverse views. So they've got an open mindset, they're tolerant of ambiguity, they don't mind if things don't quite work to plan. Less inclusive leaders like to box everything in, and so they're not, including those different views. And the last aspect of that is they do perspective taking really well. So they're able to put themselves in someone else's shoes. The next one, the fifth one, is cultural intelligence. So these leaders very motivated to understand the cultures with which they work. Not only motivated, but they have the relevant information, they have the knowledge, and then the last thing they do is they change and adapt their behaviours. And then the last one is collaboration. So collaboration being about empowerment, giving people a voice, creating an environment of psychological safety, and also making sure the team is cohesive, which is quite difficult when you have a diverse team. Actually, the ability for it to fracture along group identity lines is stronger. So an inclusive leader is the one who holds it together. So if I just kind of go around the circle again, we had commitment, we had courage, cognizance of bias, curiosity, cultural intelligence, and collaboration. And you can tell the one that we sort of pushed in there is courage. It's the courage to be humble.
Right. Versus bravado, big and out there and bold.
Yes, that's right.
Juliet, does such a leader exist?
Well, I've met many that have very strong characteristics in it. So they may not have all 6, but I have met very inclusive leaders, and we've scored them against this assessment, and we can see that other people perceive so too. And the real test is that a leader will be working with people who are very different, so different ideas, different backgrounds, different customers, different markets. And yet, despite those differences, everyone in that group says, I feel like I'm treated fairly and respectfully. I feel like I'm valued. I have a sense of belonging. I feel psychologically safe. So it's not about the law of averages that these leaders on average create inclusion. It's that with everyone that they touch, even if they have very different points of view, everyone comes out feeling like you really understood me. You know, you were committed to this topic. You were curious about me. You were collaborative, that kind of idea. So I don't think they exist on all six, but I have seen some pretty impressive leaders. Yeah.
I mean, we've had, certainly in Australia here, we've had a fairly significant election, and just leading up to the election, we had the sad news of the passing of an Australian great leader. And I often hear the commentary about when people talk about Bob Hawke and his passing, about his leadership style being, one of them is a shared moment. There's always this shared moment, this personal connection that he's made, either if he's talking to the Prime Minister or world leaders or, you know, the average Joe Blow on the streets, that shared connectedness. The other construct that you mentioned there in your summary of leaders, I guess, inclusive leaders, is this sense of belongingness. And I know that some of the tech firms out there, and I know also Atlassian, I know we have some people from Atlassian joining us. I do know that belongingness is a key construct that they measure as an output for teams as well. So I think I sense that's a strong dimension to what inclusive leaders look like, yeah?
And we just, yes, exactly. And we just interviewed Aubrey, actually, who's the D&I lead. And she was talking about the way that Atlassian frames it as sort of balance and belonging. And those two things are important. Balance in terms of the people around the table. So not just think about it in terms of diversity, but a balanced representation of people. And I think belonging is a core sentiment. I also think, though, that there has been a bit of an overlooking of this idea of fairness and this sort of, it's a very foundational level. And yes, of course, everyone wants to feel like they belong, but one of the indications that you belong is that you're treated fairly, and micro fairnesses. By micro fairnesses, I mean that your email was answered, that you're not interrupted, that you had an equal share of voice with other people. So those micro fairnesses give people an indication that they are part of the team. And valued, that's right. They're the two. So we say fairness and respect, value and belonging, inspiration and confidence, confidence to speak up.
Julie, I am mindful that we've got a number of people joining us on this live webinar broadcast. In fact, there's over 90 people, I understand, and it will also be recorded. I do strongly encourage you that if you have any comments or questions, to put that in the feed, and we'll address them as we go through. So please get those commentaries running in. So let's just pick up on the point about the methodology now. So you talked about the findings, the correlation between inclusive leadership practices, or what did you call this, the 6C framework, and it producing positive organisational outcomes, inclusion being one of those organisational outcomes. Take us through the methodology to which you employ. We know that it's cross-cultural. There are a number of different countries that Deloitte included in this research piece. Take us through who you talked to.
So who we talked to was senior leaders in particular, and it was cross-country. So we started in Australia, talking to another number of our clients here, and then we moved out to New Zealand, and then we moved out to the US and the UK, and now we've dealt with leaders in France and Germany and Spain and Portugal and Netherlands and Japan and China, India. It's all a real good mix. A real good mix. And what we were talking to them about, as I said, was, you know, what goes through your mind and what are the behaviours that you do as a result of that. And then when we had defined it, we could then say, okay, what is the relationship between what that leader is doing and individuals' feelings of inclusion and the team's perceived behaviours, and then the organisational outcomes. So we could do correlations, and it's only correlational, between that sort of pathway and organisations being more innovative, more agile, more adaptive, and actually twice as likely to meet or exceed financial targets. So I think that pathway is important in terms of demonstrating the case and, you know, correlations along the way. But I think, you know, what's become important to me, and I've worked in this field for a very long time now, is that leaders listen to information like that about the importance of inclusion to individual experiences, to the team, and to the organisation's outcome, but they don't believe it. They don't believe that it's actually got anything to do with them. And so where the inclusive leadership assessment and then development program has become really important is that leaders now receive feedback. These are the micro behaviours that you are doing that are making a difference to my experience of inclusion, to how the team is performing, and therefore the leaders can adjust.
Mm-hmm.
So just to give a number around that, when we ran some analysis across the relationship between leaders' perception of themselves and the feedback that they were receiving, only a third of leaders could accurately assess whether they were seen as highly inclusive. So a third of leaders overestimated their capability, and therefore they think there's nothing that I need to do, and a third of leaders underestimated their capability and therefore weren't role modelling it because they didn't perceive themselves as accurate. So it makes a difference then too.
I note that we've got a question, and we might address this question at the moment. So the question is, could you tell us more about how organisations have set themselves up to create more inclusion?
I think they've done, the organisations that we work with, a number of different things, and a lot of it has started with doing large-scale diagnostics to sort of understand the landscape. Who is feeling included? Who's not feeling included? Is it about,
are you talking about an enterprise-wide?
An enterprise-wide,
okay.
yeah. So is it people in head office versus people in the regions? Is it people from different demographic backgrounds? Is it people from marketing versus scale? Like, who experiences inclusion and why? So I see a lot of organisations doing large-scale diagnostics. I see a lot of organisations developing, I would say, narrative strategies and brand around that. You can think of a number of organisations that put advertisements out wanting to tell the world that they're highly inclusive. And then there would be probably a series of programs that HR would implement. And I think that's been the challenge. I think of that as sort of a level 2 of maturity. So a level 1 of maturity is just filling in a form and ticking boxes. So compliance is generating it. Level 2 is about a series of programs. It might be setting up a sponsorship program, setting up an employee resource group. And those things are valuable to a degree. Sponsorship is valuable. Employee resource groups create connectivity between people. They don't necessarily lead to advances in career, but they create connectivity. But what it means is that HR has become responsible for creating inclusion. And so I think the third level of maturity is actually what I would call leader-led. Mm-hmm. So, and this is where the organisations that have been working with us have said, well, how can we help the leaders to understand themselves to be more inclusive? And how can they then adjust the system around them? So taking it away from HR, leader-led. Mm-hmm. And the last thing is integrated, so that it becomes actually part of the fabric of doing business. You just wouldn't do a transformation unless you were thinking, do we have diversity of thinking? What are our inclusive principles?
Indeed, and so that's more wide or mainstream cultural transformation that we're seeing at that end, aren't we?
And very few organisations do that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I mean, anecdotally from the conversations that we've had with the people that we've been working with, and also just the commentary and the literature generally about how organisations are trying to create more be more inclusive. I think at the moment I feel like it's more compliance led rather than actually a genuine attempt of reform in this, because let's face it, this is hard to do, right? I mean, a lot of the things that, I mean, leading to the question that I asked earlier, who is this elusive inclusive leader? Almost, does he or she exist? And maybe that will be aspirational. I mean, the important thing is that we are on a journey and that we are getting better at this, because as I said earlier, I think it is really hard to be genuinely open in terms of welcoming different points of views. Having that cognitive diversity is hard, right? Because that's a different point of view to what your view is. And sometimes when you're pushing through a project, sometimes when you're working on a very tight timeline and resource constrained environment, that having a divergent point of view is not necessarily a good thing to actually getting it through. So it's difficult, right?
It is. There was a book I wrote called Which Two Heads Are Better Than One, and it exactly looked at that issue about different ways that people like to solve problems. And basically, we like to surround ourselves with people who solve problems just like we do. And we say intellectually, gosh, I need a different point of view, but when it really comes down to it, we don't. So I think it's a really great question around what are organisations doing on inclusion, but I would say inclusion of what? And inclusion of diversity of thinking is just as hard as inclusion of demographic diversity.
I'm glad you mentioned your book, because that's why I framed that sort of diversion or cognitive thinking the way I did. I do notice that we have another question from someone out there. So from your experience implementing diversity inclusion, this is almost like an eye test for me as well. What are the business values or outcomes of implementing diversity and inclusive programs?
So let me take it back then to diversity of thinking, because the way I think about diversity of thinking, it is related indirectly to demographic diversity, but we could find 3 outcomes from that. So if you have a diverse thinking group, and diversity of thinking, I think of it as the way that you approach problems, and the way that you approach problems is enabled when you have gender balance in group and you have cultural diversity, but you can reduce mistakes by up to 30%. You can increase innovation by up to 20%, and you increase the likelihood of followership. Right. So effectively, these are the data supporting this idea that collective intelligence makes a difference, which means that it is actually part of the fabric of business. It is how you do business, not an HR program. It's not a program where you have, as I said before, an employee resource group. This is, when you look around the table and you think who's at the table and how are they behaving? Are they really listening to other people's perspectives? Are they being led by someone who creates cohesion amongst the group? How could that not be central to business? So I think the outcome, as I say, is fewer risks, more innovation and more followership. There are lots of studies that try to do a match between demographic diversity and outcomes, and they have variable responses, and that's because the intervention between diversity and a business outcome is actually inclusion, a lot of that's driven by an inclusive leader.
I know that we've got a few other questions up there, but before we get on to those other questions, what I'd like to explore a bit more is that one of the underlying capabilities, I guess, of what makes a good inclusive leader, Juliet, would have to be their ability to adapt and their agility in thinking. You mentioned a number of other things associated with the 6 C's, their emotional intelligence, their cultural intelligence. So we're talking about a suite of soft skills here. We're talking about and so these have been obviously identified by a number of different literatures, including the World Economic Forum, of what makes a future-focused leader. So would you say in your research and where you are sitting today with the work that you've been doing with other organisations, that these are the fundamental skills that's necessary for leadership in the modern day era?
Yeah, I would say, fundamentally, I would say the future of work is human. Yeah. And the reason I would say that is because there's been a lot of focus at the moment on technology as a development, and that's fantastic. But once we have that technology in place, and that won't be far into the future, then the work that is left behind is the fundamentally human work. It's the interactions between people. And that's the boundary of technology. So technology still can't imitate human interactions to the degree that we want and appreciate. And that's about compassion, that's about customer service, that's about creativity, that's about problem solving with people. So I think it means something that the HBR article, when last we looked, and I think that was 2 weeks ago, had more than 100,000 views. I think people are recognising there's something in this soft skill. It sounds a bit like inclusive leadership, and it is a different type of leadership than transformational leadership or servant leadership or authentic leadership. It is the ability to lead in the frame of diverse customers, diverse markets, diverse people, diverse teams, and that's a different capability. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, thank you. Let's return to some of the questions that we've been asked here. So thank you, Juliet and Anne. You are very welcome, Hannah. I wonder if within this study, did Deloitte draw any tangible relationship between the number or quality of inclusive leaders in an organisation with its overall performance? It will be interesting to see that correlation or causation, if anything. I'm just going to, so that with correlation, we can't, there's no causation with correlation. We can only suggest that those relationships could exist in terms of a statistical response to that. So Juliet, perhaps you might like to respond to that front end of the question. Did Deloitte draw any tangible relationships between the number of quality of inclusive leaders in an organisation with its overall performance?
What a great question. I feel like that's a PhD question there. And thank you for raising that, Hannah. I hadn't thought of that before, but logically, the proportion of inclusive leaders is going to make a difference. But I haven't looked at that before, but I think your logic flow is right. And yes, it's correlational research that we've been looking at so far, but I would also expect to be able to show causation between the two.
Mm.
Yeah. But great question.
Thank you. So let's move on to Jason's question as well. So if a manager hires an employee because they're a good fit for their teams, is the manager not considering diversity? I mean, that's the paradox, almost that catch-22 that we were talking about earlier. You want to make sure that you're hiring across different skill sets, across different, lenses, but yet you also want a good fit culturally. I mean, are they paradoxical in terms almost?
I don't know if they are paradoxical, because
Okay.
I would see inclusion as, you're dealing with each individual as an individual. The only way that I think of cultural fit in terms of, does the person have the right values for our organisation? And I do think that people can be quite certain about saying these are the values that we expect in our organisation, and we don't tolerate certain other values, and not say, in the name of inclusion, we will accept everything. So, for example, if an employee wanted to work with me and said, one of my values is fraud, I would say, you're not the right person for us. One of our values is integrity. So I do think that we can be certain about that. But diversity, it should be looking for, do they have the right values? Do they have a growth mindset? Do they have a learning mindset? And then do they have the diversity of skills that we need for our organisation? So I don't necessarily see them as a paradox. What were you thinking? Why did you see them as a paradox?
No, I mean, because the question that Jason raised, I guess, is that, I mean, the whole thing about we are wanting to be brave, we wanting to be curious, courageous, and all those other lovely words that you mentioned in our pursuit for diverse teams. But yeah, at the same time, we're also afraid of accepting or at the expense of not getting that project through in time for whatever reasons. And so they almost are. I mean, if you're bringing on someone that has very diverse views to that, to the team's mission or to the project's mission,
right.
It may be a derailment, I guess. I mean, look, I'm not sure if that's where Jason was going. That's certainly how I interpreted that question.
Yeah, I mean, you get speed through homogeneity.
Yes.
But you don't get great outcomes. So, I mean, that's not true. That's a bit flippant. But if your
it makes it harder. But
well, if your outcome is something very simple, you're got an assembly line, or you're flipping a hamburger, you don't need as much diversity of thinking. But if it's a complex problem, as most of our issues in the world today are, then you do need diversity of thinking. So it is about hiring for diversity in terms of thinking diversity. It's making sure that the hiring does not unfairly differentiate between people of different demographic backgrounds, because brains come in all shapes and sizes, so we need to be open to that. But inclusion is treating everyone. And that's why the inclusive leadership assessment is so important, because it tells you, yes, the people who are more like you feel like you're treating them fairly and respectfully, feel like you really value them, that they are psychologically safe. The people who are different to you have a very different experience. And you use the word adaptation. And that's how I think about inclusive leadership. It is the person adapting to the needs of someone else, adapting the environment to make sure that everyone gets the opportunity to contribute, rather than having my behaviours just resonate with people who look like me, or rather having the environment built for someone just like me.
So I'm mindful of the time as well, and I've got a couple of other things just to discuss with you, Juliet. I'm going to take the discussion in a bit broader terms. When we talk about diversity and the composition at a team level, when we look around at the actual leaders who are in leadership positions in organisations, I have to say that they are anything but diverse. So how is it that these leading organisations who are espousing these diverse views that are lacking that diversity themselves, how does that work?
Because I think we're in a state of transition. I don't think that we have paid a lot of attention, real attention, to diversity until relatively recently. And I would put that recently depending on the country. But if I think about Australia, I think we've gone through waves of attention to diversity. Our most recent wave started in 2010. So we're only talking 9 years of concerted. I mean, there was something that happened at the beginning of the century, there was something that happened in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, and now there's something that's happened today. And so there just hasn't been an awareness that the concrete that we've set up around ourselves has really only worked for one group of people, worked well. So if you think about flexibility as an example, a structure that we have that says that we work let's just say 9 to 5 on site really works for a certain kind of person and a certain kind of family establishment, and it doesn't work for other kinds of people. So, how do we change the concrete so that it is more inclusive? I think, back to your point around the leaders are representative of a 20 to 30 year, or let's even say 10 to 20 year history, because they've been in those organisations 10 to 20 years. What we're doing now is creating awareness in those leaders and capability to be more inclusive, and we're changing the pipeline that works to them. But fundamentally, people choose people who are just like them. And so those leaders are choosing the leaders of tomorrow, just like them, in terms of cognitive diversity, in terms of demographic diversity. People change themselves to look and feel more like the leader. So they this is where the whole thing about covering comes in, which is a very important concept in the US in particular, that people kind of hide who they are to make sure that they fit in a bit more. So kind of reducing that aspect of themselves. So, for example, LGBTI is a very good example where people would be afraid to call that out, reducing that knowledge about being LGBTI, being in the closet, rather than saying this is who I am, because the previous leaders didn't know how to deal with that, didn't appreciate it, didn't value it. So I think we're in transition, but I think the status quo is towards homogeneity. And without the deliberate intervention of every individual, the status quo is the one that is more likely to slip into the future than something different.
I mean, I guess the underlying issue there is selection bias is very much prevalent in play at the moment. And, it does take a generational shift, in fact. But you are quite right, Juliet. We are in transition. I think there's a lot of work that's been done in the right direction. I mean, certainly global movements such as the Me Too movement has made this issue a lot more topical, and that people are really now, the expectations of people is for that diverse in a genuine sense rather than just a symbolic gesture of diversity, and what that means and how that plays out in their own lives and also in their workplaces. So I think that we are in this significant shift in our times, and I think that's something that we should all be proud of and get behind.
And I think we know we're in transition because we're actually in backlash. Yeah. So if we look at the movements around kind of Brexit, and we look at Trump, and we even look at the stuff that's been happening in Australia as well, the more that we see that backlash, the more that it means that people are feeling uncomfortable with a world that is more global, that is more open. And so the desire to kind of retract, kind of make America great again, it's sort of a nostalgic view, which is at odds with, in fact, globalization. So yes, it's in transition. The bias is always towards the status quo, and the resistance that we see is symbolic of the fact that we're in transition, and it's hard.
It is hard work. And I take you back to one of the first things that we discussed this morning. You mentioned that there are a number of gaps, and so a third of leaders in terms of self-evaluation are either inflating their own perceptions of what the inclusive leadership style is, and a third are also below, missing the mark. How do we actually get that? How do we close the gaps there?
And I think the first part of it has to be awareness.
Okay.
So the leaders themselves, and this would be true, I think, of any leadership development areas, that it's very hard for leaders to get feedback. Yeah. I mean, people just don't give leaders feedback because there's too much at risk to give that. So an assessment tool is a good way of doing that, because it means it's anonymised, it means it's aggregated with other people. So I do think mechanisms to give people feedback, and then giving them coaching to help them to adjust that frame, to really make sense of the feedback they're receiving. It's very kind of practical adjustments that they can make. So for example, one of the leaders that I was working with, he got very specific feedback that when he was under pressure, he would shut down the conversation, shut down the contributions that other people were making, and he would talk over the top of them. Very specific, and it made people feel that they weren't included by him. And when I was coaching him about that and saying, you've received this feedback, and he said, look, I sort of knew that I was doing that, but I didn't realise how important it was for other people. It was the first time, and he's probably, I'd say, mid-40s, the first time he had ever received feedback that this very tactical thing of interrupting people and not letting them finish was having a marked effect on people's feelings of inclusion. And what we mean by that is that they felt they were treated fairly, that they were valued, and that they felt safe to speak up. So it really wasn't safe to speak up and have a different point of view when this guy was under pressure. So the feedback enabled him to hear it, to adjust, and then to put in place some sort of experiments. Because the hardest thing for him is that after 20 years of doing this, every time he gets into one of these situations where he's under pressure, he goes back to trying to close the conversation down, interrupt people, just make a decision, move on. So working with him, sort of micro experiments to change his mindsets and behaviours. I think he got a mindset shift quite quickly. I think it's the behavioural shift.
Is it working?
It's a good question. I've got a follow-up call with him. But I would have high hopes for him because I think he had that epiphany about it. So when we do coaching sessions, we do, 4 over a series of 8 months or something like that. So I've got to catch up with him, and that's the question I'll be asking him.
See how the longitudinal change. I mean, I guess it'd be almost a reflex reaction for you to be defensive about that type of feedback, right? And, in his case, for example, hypothetically speaking, that he could justify or arguably say, well, that they need to grow thicker skin, or they need to be able to deal with that kind of, we're all adults in this room here. So it's only natural, I guess, for the person who is the recipient for that type of sort of gap analysis that you're talking about to be defensive. I mean, I'm just wondering how people can take this. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some leaders that take it, that are defensive around it. Yeah. I've got one in mind, and she's been a very difficult character to deal with. But I'd have to say, in the main, I would say 80% of the leaders that I deal with are very open to feedback. I mean, one of the reasons that they're good leaders is because they've had feedback in general, and they've adapted their behaviours from a sort of technical point of view, maybe not as much from a sort of human point of view. But yes, every now and again, those leaders, and the leader that I'm thinking of, the woman, actually it is highly symbolic of her inability to receive feedback in very many domains. Right. And she's not going to be long for that organisation, I suspect. And that's happened to me twice now, where this has revealed that the person isn't really receptive to feedback, and they haven't remained with the organisation. But by and large, I find the leaders to be quite mature and to say, tell me what I need to know. I think it is a journey for them, but actually I find more openness than defensiveness. Now, it could be the organisations that I'm dealing with. We also have, as part of this program, not just getting assessed, but actually taking people on a journey. Why would you be assessed? Let's do some self-assessment. So we take them to want to get the assessment. We don't just plonk right in. So maybe that's been part of the lack of defensiveness. I don't know.
Yeah, and I suppose that is also, I mean, the result or the outcomes to which you seek is really dependent on the individual and where they are relative in terms of their being closed-minded or open-minded and receptive to that feedback. One of the things that we're trying to pursue, and this is why we're so, I guess, this whole topic is just so much resonates with what the work we're trying to do as Macquarie Business School, as Macquarie University, indeed through the Global MBA, is that pursuit of genuine, authentic discussions on what makes an inclusive leader through our representations of being diverse, accessible and inclusive. I mean, so some of the things that we try to do that in the program is to have a curriculum that looks and examines different leadership types and under what organisational circumstances would be a best fit for different types of leaders. And we're not just talking about large organisations as well. There's a whole bunch of like micro organisations out there, small startups that, contrary to the public perception of that sort of, I know I'm wearing black myself today, but a white male wearing black and and riding a skateboard, that is not the contrary. That's a sort of popular myth of leadership, but that leadership comes in all forms, all shapes and sizes, and doesn't necessarily just include leading, but also following. I think that's what point that you mentioned earlier. So I think this is really fantastic research that's coming out of Deloitte. Unless there are any final comments or questions from the audience, I think we've covered them all, yeah? Juliet, are there any final comments or questions that you would like to sort of share with us on your article here?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't going to go to the article, but I think the article is really good because it gives people practical tips. So that's, I think, why it's had such resonance. It's not just talking conceptually or theoretically, but giving good tips. For example, like the interruption one that I talked about before. But What I want to say, Lan, was that one of the reasons I've been so supportive of the global MBA program that Macquarie has done is because thinking about the future of work and the future of work being more human oriented, you've developed a program that helps people to work with other people, to do problem solving within the program, rather than just being a sort of very kind of didactic, here's the information, take it away. Here's how to write a spreadsheet, go and implement a spreadsheet. So, I mean, kudos to you at Macquarie for doing that. And kudos really to the students and to the academics for being part of something that I think is helping to reshape what we understand leadership to mean.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time this morning, Juliet. This will be recorded and accessible shortly after we end this broadcast. Thank you for those who joined us live, and tune in to our next webinar coming up very soon. Thank you again.